Most people looked at the first headline and thought the story was over. Washington and Tel Aviv declared that Iran's Air Force had been effectively destroyed, and the claim came wrapped in the full theater of modern power. A podium, a satellite image, cratered runways, wrecked hangars, and the calm confidence of officials who sounded certain they had already written the ending. Then the missiles kept flying. That is the part that matters. Not the press line, not the photo, not the victory language. The part that matters is that while one side was announcing collapse, the other side was already proving it, still retained the ability to strike Israel itself, threaten American positions across the region, and push the Hormuz equation straight into the global economy. So if we want to understand what these 40 days really revealed, we have to separate two different things. One is visible destruction, and the other is actual warfighting capacity. In this conflict, those two were not the same thing, and that gap is where the strategic lesson begins. The American and Israeli logic was not difficult to understand. Hit the air bases, hit the radar network, hit command centers, hit fixed infrastructure, and degrade the opponent's ability to respond. That model worked against states whose military architecture depended heavily on conventional aircraft, centralized facilities, and static positions. But Iran has spent years preparing for a different kind of war. It dispersed its striking power across ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and large drone inventories. More important, many of those systems did not depend on vulnerable airfields in the first place. They depended on mobility, concealment, preset targeting, decentralization, and the ability to keep operating even after key facilities were damaged. So that is why the declaration of total destruction rang hollow almost immediately. You can crater a runway. You cannot crater every mobile launcher on every road. You can damage a radar site. You cannot erase every pre-planned strike package already built into a missile force designed for distributed retaliation. And once that became visible, the tone of the conflict changed. Before dawn on one of the key April strike windows, air raid sirens sounded over Tel Aviv. This was not an exercise, not a demonstration, not a symbolic launch for television. Iranian ballistic missiles were incoming, carrying heavy warheads and descending at extreme speed. Israeli and Allied air defense systems responded at full intensity, interceptors rose, fireballs flashed across the sky, and some incoming threats were destroyed, but not all of them. That is the point. In modern missile warfare, not all is enough to alter strategy, public confidence, and escalation math. At roughly the same time, alarms spread across American facilities in the Gulf. Bases in the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Qatar all faced the same basic problem: a growing density of threats arriving from multiple vectors: drones, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and the constant burden of uncertainty filled the radar picture until defense became not a question of superiority, but of endurance. And that is where the public rhetoric started colliding with the economics of air defense. A defense network can look invincible in a briefing slide. It looks different when dozens or hundreds of low-cost threats force repeated launch decisions, repeated interceptions, repeated reload cycles, and constant judgment under time pressure. That is not a cinematic problem. That is inventory math. Reports from the period captured one of the strangest images of the war. Some American personnel facing the prospect of incoming missiles and drones reportedly sought shelter away from exposed base areas, including in nearby hotels. Then came claims that Iranian intelligence followed signals associated with those movements, and that those sites themselves became vulnerable. Whether every detail of every report will hold up under future scrutiny is less important than what the story reveals about the atmosphere of the conflict. The most expensive military machine in the world was operating under enough pressure that avoidance, dispersal, and survivability started to matter as much as dominance. That is not the picture usually sold to the public, but it is closer to reality. Why would forces trained and equipped at enormous cost behave that way? Because they understood the threat. Iranian ballistic systems, especially the Khorramshahr family, often cited in regional analysis, were presented as weapons with long range, very heavy payloads, high terminal velocity, and maneuver capacity that complicates interception. No serious planner treats that lightly. And then there is the cost exchange ratio, the coldest part of the whole story. If an interceptor costs well over $1 million and the incoming threat is far cheaper to build or launch, the defender is winning tactically while bleeding strategically. Missile defense can stop attacks. It can also become a machine for self-exhaustion. Iran's concept leaned directly into that asymmetry. It did not need every missile to get through. It did not need every drone to hit. It only needed to force the defender to keep spending, keep firing, keep depleting finite magazines, and keep proving that protecting the sky is far more expensive than polluting it with threats. That is one of the harshest truths of modern asymmetric conflict. Victory is not always about who possesses the better platform. Sometimes it is about who can survive the consumption rate, who can absorb losses, replace munitions, sustain tempo, and continue imposing costs after the first dramatic strike package has already been spent. Then came the Strait of Hormuz, the real pressure point on the larger geopolitical board. Roughly a third of the world's seaborne crude moves through that narrow corridor, alongside critical energy exports from Gulf producers, including liquefied natural gas. At its narrowest, the geography is so tight that military control, denial, and threat projection become disproportionately powerful. When Iran moved to signal or impose a blockade posture, the market reaction was immediate. Brent crude futures surged by more than 15% in a single day. Traders began talking openly about scenarios near $120 a barrel, with some voices floating 150 or even 200 if disruption continued. And that was not a regional side effect, that was the main event spilling into the global economy. Once Hormuz is endangered, the shockwave runs from Gulf exporters to European households, from Indian manufacturing costs to Japanese import vulnerability, and from shipping insurance to inflation expectations in the United States. This is where the conflict stopped being a military story and became a chain reaction. Higher oil prices feed transportation costs, transportation feeds consumer prices, and consumer prices feed political pressure. Political pressure feeds election risk. The battlefield extends outward until it lands in supermarket bills, fuel receipts, and central bank anxiety. For Washington, that meant the war could not be evaluated only in terms of military prestige or alliance signaling. Domestic inflation matters, equity markets matter, voter sentiment matters. An administration can speak like an empire abroad and still be trapped by gasoline prices at home. That is not ideology. That is political physics. Iran seemed to understand this clearly. Its response was not one-dimensional. Strikes on Israel served as direct military retaliation. Threats to American bases served as political signaling, a message that the United States could not assume sanctuary simply by operating from Gulf territory. A pressure on Hormuz served as economic coercion directed at the whole system. Those three moves together created a classic dilemma for the American side. Keep escalating and the costs accumulate while the opponent refuses to collapse on schedule. Pull back and the earlier triumphalist language starts to look reckless, even detached from reality. Great powers dislike many things. Public contradiction is near the top of the list. During those 40 days, the United States and Israel did not stop fighting back. Air operations continued. Sanctions pressure remained in place. Diplomatic coercion also continued through multiple channels. But sustained combat burns through money and stockpiles at a pace that peacetime audiences almost always underestimate. Market-based estimates circulating during the crisis suggested that American munition expenditure in the Middle East had climbed into ranges exceeding $10 billion per month. Tomahawk inventories, according to multiple analysts watching the pace of use, were not built for an open-ended consumption spiral on that scale. Weapons are expensive. Sustained readiness is more expensive. War multiplies both. Iran, of course, also paid a serious price. Air bases were hit. Parts of its air defense network were damaged. Sanctions of pressure, already severe, combined with wartime disruption to deepen economic strain on ordinary people. It would be dishonest to present the country as untouched or the population as insulated. There are no clean winners in a conflict like this. Israeli civilians spent nights under warning sirens, and in shelters, Iranian civilians lived under the strain of bombardment, sanctions, uncertainty, and fear. Outside the direct war zone, countries dependent on stable energy imports faced rising costs that threatened social calm and industrial planning. Still, one hard fact emerged from the fog. Iran did not collapse. Not politically, not militarily, not operationally. It continued launching ballistic missiles, drones, and cruise missiles in waves, replenishing where it could, dispersing command functions, and leaning on a wider regional network that complicated Israeli and American planning. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps did not appear to lose command cohesion in the way early public claims implied. Mobile launchers remained active. Axis partners and aligned actors, including the Houthis in Yemen and Hezbollah, pressure from the Lebanese front, helped widen the strategic picture. Iran was not trying to win a neat parade ground victory. It was trying to make defeat too expensive for the other side to pursue. That logic has historical echoes. The stronger power often assumes that technical superiority, financial depth, and superior strike capability will settle the issue quickly. Then time enters the war. Then cost enters the war. Then political tolerance enters the war. And suddenly the stronger power is no longer asking, can we hit them, but how long can we keep paying for this? Vietnam remains the obvious historical comparison, not because the contexts are identical, but because the strategic mechanism is familiar. The United States did not leave Vietnam because it forgot how to fight. It left because the cost structure, a political burden, and public tolerance produced a result that military advantage alone could not reverse. Iran's wartime logic in these 40 days pointed in a similar direction: bleed the stronger side, tire the stronger side, force it to spend more, intercept more, explain more, and promise more than it can sustain comfortably. The goal is not always to destroy the stronger adversary. Sometimes it is enough to make continuation look irrational. That helps explain why the temporary ceasefire emerged on April 7th through Pakistani mediation. Pakistan had channels to Iran, relationships across the broader Muslim world, and enough communication with Washington to function as an acceptable intermediary. In periods like this, the mediator is rarely the most powerful state. It is the state that all sides can still tolerate speaking to. The deeper question is why the major belligerents were willing to listen at that stage. The answer is simple. After 40 days, neither side could credibly expect a quick, clean, total outcome. The fantasy script of a brief decapitation campaign, followed by surrender or regime destabilization, had already failed in the opening phase. What followed after that was not clarity. It was inertia, face-saving, internal bargaining, alliance management, and the search for an off-ramp that did not look like humiliation. Temporary ceasefires in this kind of conflict are rarely proof of resolution. More often, they are pauses negotiated by exhausted systems that need time to recalculate. So, what did the war actually demonstrate? First, propaganda victory and operational victory are not the same thing. Saying the enemy is finished may shape headlines for a day, but if incoming missiles are still crossing the sky, the phrase collapses under its own weight. Narrative control matters, but it does not alter trajectories. Second, air superiority does not automatically produce war superiority. Israel and the United States plainly retain superior conventional air power. But Iran showed that a dispersed missile and drone architecture can still deliver meaningful retaliation, even after severe damage to fixed aviation infrastructure. Control of the air is important. It is not the whole war. Third, the Strait of Hormuz remains one of the most potent strategic levers in the world economy. Whoever can credibly threaten it can impose pressure far beyond the immediate battlefield. This conflict did not create that fact. It reminded the world of it very forcefully, in real time, with prices moving almost instantly. Fourth, no major military power should assume that aerial suppression alone can solve a conflict against an opponent with mature ballistic missile capacity. That is the real warning embedded in these 40 days. A state can lose aircraft, bases, radars, and still retain enough decentralized strike power to keep the conflict alive and dangerous. Fifth, and this is the most human point, the bill is always paid by ordinary people. It is paid by families hiding underground in Israel. It is paid by civilians in Iran enduring sanctions, disruptions, and fear. It is paid by workers, truck drivers, factory owners, importers, and households around the world when energy prices surge and purchasing power shrinks. The temporary ceasefire should not be mistaken for resolution. The shadow over Hormuz did not disappear. The hostility between Israel and Iran did not evaporate. The structural issues driving the conflict remained in place, and none of them were solved by a few signatures, a mediated pause, or carefully worded statements from officials eager to sound in control. That is why the original image now looks different in hindsight. A spokesman standing in front of a satellite photograph declaring complete destruction seemed to embody certainty. After 40 days of strikes, alarms, interceptions, oil volatility, and strategic improvisation, that same image feels less like proof and more like a warning about the danger of believing one's own script. Pride is dangerous in war. Underestimating the enemy is worse. Announcing victory too early can become an invitation for reality to answer back. And reality usually answers in fragments of metal, insurance premiums, exhausted stockpiles, and political panic. That is the part television prefers to edit out. There is another lesson here, one that sits beneath the military details. The old assumption that overwhelming technology guarantees coercive success is breaking down in more and more theaters. Precision weapons still matter, stealth still matters, intelligence still matters. But they now operate inside a larger matrix shaped by cost curves, attrition rates, dispersed launch systems, and economic choke points. In that matrix, cheap mass can threaten exquisite systems. Mobility can outlive fixed infrastructure. A road mobile launcher can preserve deterrence after an airbase is wrecked. A relatively inexpensive drone can force a defender to use a premium interceptor. A narrow waterway can do what an entire air campaign cannot: frighten the global market in a matter of hours. This does not mean Iran emerged stronger in every sense. It suffered real damage and real economic stress. It does mean that the campaign failed to produce the decisive strategic collapse that public messaging implied. That distinction matters because it tells us something about how future wars will be fought, sold, and misunderstood. It also tells us something about the limits of military spectacle. Satellite images are powerful, press conferences are powerful, the visual grammar of victory is powerful. But war is not a slide presentation. It is a prolonged contest of adaptation, logistics, signaling, industrial depth, and political stamina. The camera sees the crater. It does not always see the remaining launchers. And that brings us back to the wider geopolitical board. If the price of trying to enforce regional order keeps rising while adversaries become cheaper, more distributed, and more resilient, then even a superpower starts looking constrained. Not weak, exactly. Constrained, bound by stockpiles, alliances, inflation, domestic politics, and the stubborn refusal of the battlefield to obey the briefing room. That is why these 40 days matter beyond the Middle East. They expose the gap between what advanced militaries promise and what they can actually guarantee under saturation conditions. They expose the fragility of global energy arteries. They expose the degree to which economic pressure and military pressure now merge into a single instrument. For neutral observers, the safest conclusion is not triumphalism for either side, it is caution. Iran proved more resilient than its enemies publicly admitted. The United States and Israel proved more capable than their enemies would like to claim. Both things can be true at once. The larger truth is that escalation in this theater carries costs far beyond the states firing the missiles. So the ceasefire is not an ending. It is an interval. It is the moment when all parties inhale, count what they have spent, assess what they have lost, test what the market is saying, listen to what their publics are saying, and decide whether the next move will be negotiation, pressure, covert action, or another round of fire. The region is still a powder magazine. Hormuz is still a choke point. Israel and Iran are still locked in a hostility that no temporary arrangement can dissolve. And the United States is still trying to balance deterrence, alliance credibility, domestic politics, and economic stability at the same time. That is not a solved equation, not even close. So when people ask what happened in those 40 days, the answer is not that one side simply won and the other simply lost. The answer is that a very expensive theory of war collided with a very stubborn form of strategic resilience. The answer is that public declarations outran battlefield reality. The answer is that the world was reminded once again that modern conflict is decided not only by firepower, but by endurance, logistics, and the ability to impose pain across the entire system. And the final question remains open. Was the ceasefire the start of de-escalation, or merely the short silence before the next round? If Iran's demonstrated resilience forces a revision of American and Israeli strategy in the region, then these 40 days may be remembered not as an isolated crisis, but as a warning shot from a new era. Because in the end, the most important image was never the podium. It was the contradiction, a claim of total destruction on one side and incoming retaliation on the other. So that contradiction is the whole story, and history has a habit of punishing anyone who mistakes theater for control.